but I guess we could do it at some point.
Okay, recording. Okay, we're going to talk about positioning.
Most important.
You saw this meme last time. Positioning is quite tricky in CSS. You'll probably encounter this when you start playing around with some of these things extending where they shouldn't be. Can anyone name any ways that you position stuff in CSS?
Position absolute.
Yeah. Any other ways? Relative, yeah.
And also margin.
Is overflow with push?
Sorry?
Overflow?
Kind of. Float, was that something you've done in your homework, right?
Yes, float.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll get on to position, attribute, floats, flexbox, and grid, which you probably haven't come across yet. So positioning, the position CSS property is probably like the simplest one in that it's only one thing that you change. It allows you to organize elements on screen. And there's 4 values for the position attribute. Static is the default. If you don't set position, it's always static on, I think, every element. It means that it's not positioned in any way other than just how it is in HTML. It's the standard. It's displayed where it normally would be, and we use the term not positioned to describe stuff that are positioned static. The next one is relative. Relative is effectively the same as static, but when it's position relative, you get these 4 extra properties which you can adjust: top, left, right, and bottom. And the element is positioned relative to itself, which makes a bit more sense if I show you this. So here's two divs. I think they're divs. Yeah, they are divs. And they're both currently position static, the default. All right. Now I'm going to make this blue one here. I'm going to make that position relative. Okay, it's just position relative now. It's exactly the same, all right? It's exactly the same because I haven't set top, left, bottom, or right to anything yet. So if I add left 10 pixels, now it's, you see, it's moved 10 pixels from the left. And if I set that to 100 pixels, then it'll move more. And then if I set top, it's moved 10 pixels down. And it's this 100 pixels, 10 pixels, this is relative to itself. So what that means is if I inspect this in the Chrome inspector, where is it? What the heck? It's moved 100 pixels left of itself, where it should be, which is here, right? And then
But still jump over each other.
yeah. So if I put this one down here, then it'll overflow over other things, because effectively this element is actually it's still there, or at least it should be. That's where it is in the actual flow of the document, but we're moving it outside of the regular flow of the document there. The next one is fixed. Position fixed is it's positioned relative to the screen of your device. So of the device in this case is the browser, so the viewport. And it'll always be in the same place. It'll ignore scroll. And again, it's still got the top, left, bottom, and right attributes. So this right here, this is position fixed. Unfortunately, you can't see it very well because it's in black, but yeah, it's got position fixed, bottom 0, right 0. If I get rid of bottom right, if I just have position fixed, then it's going to be positioned in the top left by default. If I put bottom 0, right 0, then it's going to be positioned down here. And if I scroll down in this page, then it's still positioned there. All right, it's fixed. And the reason I've skipped absolute is because absolute I think is the most complicated one. It's the most confusing one. Absolute works the same way fixed does, but instead of being positioned relative to the viewport, which is the browser window, it's positioned relative to the nearest positioned element in the DOM. So that's the confusing bit.
So that's not static.
No, it's not static. It's anything that isn't static is a positioned element. Static is a non-positioned element. So absolute is relative to its nearest ancestor, which has anything except for static. So anything that has position relative, position absolute, or position fixed. Oh no, not this one. Positioning. So, okay, right here we've got two. I'll open up the inspector so you can see what's going on here. So we got these two containers here. There's this purple one here, and then there's this one here. Okay, so within this purple parent container, this one is, if I look at it, parent container has position relative set on it, right? It doesn't have. I haven't set any top values or any bottom values, so it's in effect it's positioned exactly where it would be if it was static. I can set a top value or whatever because it's position relative, right? And then within that parent container, we have this absolute div here, and that has position absolute and bottom 0, right 0. So exactly like that last one I just showed with the fixed one, bottom 0 and right 0. See, if this was fixed instead of absolute, it's down here now. You can't see it, but it's down here. Because that would be 0 bottom and 0 right relative to the viewport, which is there, right? But because it's absolute and not fixed, it's relative to its nearest ancestor, which is position relative.
So what do you think happens if will removes the position relative from the parent container?
Yeah.
Say it again.
So if will removes the position relative from the parent container.
This one.
Yeah, it will be down.
It'll go down here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't see it because it's hidden behind that one, but yeah, it's down here.
So if there is nothing that's has a positioning that's containing the absolute positioned div, then it will be relative to the body.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's relative means that it's relative for the container what's inside. If it's inside a div, so it's relative to the div, to that old block.
Yeah, as long as that div has a position. If you haven't set a position on that div, then it's position static, which means it's unpositioned. And absolute is only relevant relative to positioned divs. This is where it's confusing.
So what's
So if I didn't have this position relative on its parent, then it disappears down here. I'm just going to hide this one to make that clearer.
so inside?
So its parent container is currently relative. If I take that off, so it doesn't have position relative, then what does it have by default?
It will go down.
What will the position of this be by default if I hadn't set position relative?
Static.
Static, yeah, which means it's unpositioned. So there. So it's now, it has no, its parent container has no positioning. It's static, which means that it goes back to the body,
Okay.
and yeah, it ends up down there.
So what happens if you set it to position absolute, the parent container? What do you think will happen? So if the parent container is position absolute, where will the
To be
the
down.
red box be? Why?
Because it's become relative to that web page all.
No, because try to
Can you find out?
The corner.
so it's still relative to the parent container.
I'm not entirely sure why it's gone there.
It's because it's not within the DOM anymore.
Okay, right. So that's just its default, I suppose.
So basically, if the parent container has position relative, position absolute, position fixed, or even position sticky, which is not that used anymore, or anyway, then the red box, the absolute box, will be relatively positioned to the parent.
Okay.
So it's absolute, but relative to its parent.
Yeah.
Which is kind of confusing.
Yeah, a little bit, but yeah, it's understandable.
So if you see, like, the actual tree of this website, there are these two divs, which are both parents, and both of them have one div class absolute inside of them. That's all they have. And these two have the same class. So these two red ones are identical. They both have position absolute. But this one ends up in the corner of this div, whereas this one ends up in the corner of the viewport. And that's because of what their parents have set on them, right?
Yeah.
This one's parent is position relative, whereas this one's parent is position static, which is a default. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Position absolute gets confusing and messy. I don't really use it. Most of the time you use float or flexbox or grid. Historically, in the 90s, have you used tables to lay stuff out? Tables for laying things out? Let's say you want columns, would you use a table? Yeah. I think historically in the 90s, that was like the only way there was to get columns in your website. So people used them a lot. But yeah, it's rigid, inflexible, hard to maintain, not well suited to responsive designs. Like here's an example of what something would look like as a table versus like if you're using CSS and CSS positioning, you can write it like that, which is like way clearer what's going on, right? So floats were introduced, I think, around 2004 or something, and they were never intended to be a general layout tool. The initial, you've all used floats, right? You've tried floats, right? Yeah. So the initial intention for floats was to get text to wrap around an image or like another element. So like on print layout, you'd quite often see this, like in a magazine or something, where the text flows around an image like that. So that's like what float was intended to do. So in this case, this image here, I've set float left on. I can also set float right on it. And then it goes on the right. And you can have multiple elements floating, and one will go after the other. So all of these are float right at the moment. And I can make them all float left. And they'll, one go after the other.
So float we just use for the picture, or we can use it also for text?
Well, that's the thing. So they were intended for images, I think, and but people realized pretty quickly that you can use them to create column-based layouts. So they could be used for like making fairly complicated column-based layouts that you would have previously used table for. So we know that block level elements like divs don't display next to each other, right? They go down to the next line, even if their width is less than the width of the page. So if you if you have two block level elements next to each other and you set their widths to 50%, they won't go next to each other. They'll stay on individual lines. and float kind of solves that. So instead of having like box, 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 box on new lines, you use float, and they're all on the same line, right?
But how we can use it in this way? Because you have float right, so you can use percentage.
Well, we'll get to
Because
that.
like you have like, for example, for the 5 boxes against you, and if we say for all float left,
Yeah.
it's become beside each other, or
Yeah, it'll be like this. So these are all float right at the moment.
okay. But why, for example, it's coming here down, but it didn't come up?
Because they're just below all of this text.
Okay.
They're just here.
So it's what you like in HTML.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, in this case, they're images, so they'd be in line anyway, but regardless. So Float was like the main tool for creating layouts for a long while after 2004. But as I said, it was never really intended for that. So this was kind of hacky, and there were weird things that you had to do to make it work. So I'll just like demo some of that quickly. So here, let's say, so we have three divs here. Each of these blocks of text is a div. Let's say I want to display them in 3 columns, right, next to each other like that. So I'd set float left on them, right? That would be your guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus English text.
But what the hell? What's that about?
It's the div container
Yeah,
came out of the div container.
yeah. That's weird, isn't it? That,
Yeah.
like, it's coming outside of it. Why is that? That's really strange. So
And maybe if we can background stretch.
background stretch on the container.
Yeah.
No. Well, so technically these are floating outside of the div itself. This I think this should explain it slightly better, I think. So you look at this. This is like a regular page, right? This element here is float left at the moment, so you can see the text is wrapping around it. If you were to visualize it as like layers, you can see that one is actually floating above this layer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this one is also floating. This is float right, and it's kind of floating above its container. And what was I going to say? So you need to actually get the container to contain it rather than allow it to float above like that. So there was like a few ways that people came up with to make that happen. I think so there's this clear CSS attribute, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which effectively means don't allow things to float above me. So what you can do is at the end of all of these columns, at the end of this section, if you put a little div there, you put like an element, and you give it clear both, then it'll stop things from floating above it. And we heard about these pseudo selectors before. This is a pseudo selector called after, which effectively adds a bit of content after it and sets these styles to it. So if I take this class and add it here, then that'll clear it. Don't worry if you don't understand exactly how that is happening. It's like it's weird. The point is that it's a hack.
And you shouldn't use floats anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But
Right. Yeah. But it's important to know these things, I think, because floats have been used for like, I don't know, a good 10 years or something. So you'll see them everywhere. You are going to come across them. You need to know why people are doing these weird hacky things that make it work like for no real reason. There's another way you can make it work, which is to set overflow to hidden. That will also make it happen. You can also set it to overflow auto, which I think is what it is by default anyway. But by kind of explicitly putting overflow, that like reminds it to clear it.
Feels like a bug in the.
Yeah, it's weird. It's a hack. It makes no sense. So yeah, that's mainly. Luckily nowadays we don't really use float for anything other than its intended purpose, which is to wrap text around an element. You should still understand them, as you are going to come across them.
So we don't use it anymore for tablet.
We don't use it for laying things out or like making columns or anything like that. You can still use it for wrapping text around stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's a fairly niche reason to use it, but yeah. But like, I think it's super interesting. I put some links here there's a couple of articles about floats and why they work the way they do. There's also a video here. If you have any time, we don't have a lot of time to cover it now, so I'm just kind of briefly letting you know that they exist. If you have any time to read one of these, I'd recommend it, because it kind of, you'll learn quite a lot about how HTML and CSS are working behind the scenes by understanding the weirdness of floats, I think. But yeah, don't worry about it too much for now. So now we have a better tool, a couple of better tools really. One is Flexbox. This was introduced around 2012, and it's kind of the first attempt at a proper solution for layout in CSS. You can call it like a CSS3 feature, although it's not really a thing. But, so the main idea behind Flexbox, the Flex layout, is to give the container the ability to alter its children's width / height and order to best fill the available space. I'm just going to read this out. A Flex container expands items to fill available free space or shrinks them to prevent overflow. And most importantly, the Flexbox layout is direction agnostic, which means it doesn't care what direction it is. You can change the direction, as opposed to regular layouts. Block, which is vertically based, so blocks come one after the other in that order, right? Or inline, which is horizontally based, so horizontal means they come one after the other like that,
Yeah.
right? And then they go down to the next line. Flexbox, you can choose which direction it goes. So Flex and Flexbox is not a single attribute. It's kind of a whole new layout. It's kind of like, you can think of like block versus inline versus flex. So there's a kind of, there are some new concepts, I think, in that flex is applied to a parent, which then turns its children into flex items. So float and position, you would apply them directly to the element themselves that you wanted to move. With Flexbox, you would apply it to its parent. You would give that display flex. Flex properties. This is some of the flex properties. They exist on the parent. These ones, which the parent you would call the flex container. And then these properties exist on flex items, which is the children of a flex container. This is a nice little demo of some of them working. So this right here, this is a Flexbox at the moment. And each of these are items within it. These are flex items. And if I just make them a bit smaller to make it obvious. You can see they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's like the order that they are in the DOM. I can change their directions. I can make them columns. Flex direction column. Now they are like that. I can make them column reverse. Now they're starting from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Row reverse. They start from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's row. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They can also wrap. They can wrap to the next line like that. And they'll do that automatically like that, depending on their width, which is pretty cool.
It's used for calendar.
this is used for everything. Imagine like you've got a gallery, you want to show a load of items in like a grid like this, you could use that.
Or just a header with like a logo on the left side and the menu on the right side.
Yeah.
You would use Flexbox for that too.
And there are all these properties, like you can justify their content, you can center them like that. You can do space between, which adds space in between them, and that'll change depending on how wide your flex items are. You can do space around, which also puts space on these sides. And then again, like you can see this is really good for responsive layouts because it handles this sort of stuff, centering like that. You can align items at the flex start of each line like that, or the flex end of each line. You can center them within each line. You can, yeah, there's all these things. I'm not going to go over exactly what they are because there's an exercise that will teach you them all, I think in a much better way. And then, yeah, you can also set individual properties on each individual item, like order. If I increase order to 1, then that goes down here because it changes the order that it appears within the flexbox. So if I wanted like 1 and 3 to come at the end, then I could set the order of 1 and 3 to something higher than the order of these. And let's say I wanted 4 to come before 3, then I could set the order of 3 to 2 and the order of 4 to 1. And now you can see I get 1, 4, and then 3. You get that? You see what's going on with that?
So they all start at 0 by default.
Yeah, and you can increase that to any number really. That could be like 100, as long as it's higher than the previous one, then it'll go at the end. And then, yeah, you can grow an individual item like that. So you can make pretty complex layouts, which you would never be able to do this with a table. This would be super hard to do with floats. And yeah, there's all these different properties. So rather than explain all these properties to you, I think the best thing for you two guys to do is this exercise here. I'm not sure if we have time to do this now.
I don't think so.
No. So this is, you should definitely do this. This is quite fun. It doesn't take a lot of time, and this will like really teach you Flexbox in a really interactive way. So it's flexboxfroggy.com. So make sure you make a note of that.
Actually, let's post a link to Slack, and there's another game as well.
Yeah, I'll post it.
Do you know Flexbox Defense? No, not that one.
Yeah, so I posted the link in Slack. So definitely do this. It will teach you Flexbox super well. It's basically a little game where you have to try and get all of these frogs to land on their lily pads using the various properties of Flexbox.
When I was learning Flexbox back in the days, I actually also did another game, which is Flexbox Zombies, which I thought was even better than the other one. So if you have time for both, then do both, because both are really fun and they explain Flexbox much better than reading a lot of tutorials.
So basically, like, I had to learn layout with floats before Flexbox, and I had to attempt loads of exercises of laying out complex layouts using just floats, and it's horrible. It's like really, really aggravating, and you don't know what the hell's going on. So you guys are pretty lucky that you can kind of skip that. I think like we've got to the stage now where everybody is using Flexbox. The browser support is something like 98.5% now. You can use Flexbox and it'll work everywhere. So just use it, it's way better. Just be aware that float exists. And then there's also grid. Grid is kind of the new kid in town. It's newer than Flexbox. It hasn't been used that much yet because it didn't have particularly good browser support until fairly recently. So if we use this website we looked at last week, Can I Use? You can see Flexbox has 98.6% browser coverage, whereas Grid has only 92%. And that's a lot higher. Like the last time I looked at it, that was like 87% or something. So this is going up, but it's still not perfect. You can't always use Grid and assume that it'll work. There are lots of old browsers out there that don't support it. But yeah, you should also learn Grid at some point, but don't worry about it for now. I think Flex is more useful. But generally, Flexbox is like for one-dimensional layouts, and Grid is for two-dimensional layouts. So one dimension being like it's just a row, whereas 2 dimensions is more like it's a proper grid of content, right? So I would use Flexbox for something that's one-dimensional like this, because it's kind of easier. It's easier to maintain. It's less code. Whereas for a 2-dimensional thing like this, you can use Grid. It's maybe easier. So there's also once you've done the Flexbox Froggy thing. I actually wouldn't worry about this for now. I don't think this is actually part of the curriculum. But if you're interested in learning Grid, then there's this. This is the same sort of thing as the Flexbox Froggy. It's a little game for learning Grid. And then there's a little article here, which is worth reading, which is kind of Grid versus Flexbox. So I kind of rushed through that so that we can get on to the rest of the stuff that we need to cover today. But yeah, I would definitely recommend looking at Flexbox Froggy. I've only told you that these things exist. I haven't taught you how to use them. Flexbox Froggy will teach you how to use Flexbox. Okay. And yeah, we don't really have time for the exercise today, so I think we'll have to move swiftly on to media queries and stuff in order for you guys to know enough to do the homework.
Do you have any questions?